and this is a debate we've had at length, is why is self-preservation more prevalent than the preservation of other people? So why do you have more of a duty to protect yourself than you do to protect other people? Just like think about it further.
I think just to take it, I do agree with that you shouldn't, it's irrational to put a legal obligation on moral, but on the flip side of it, it would be good to put legal obligation on moral things, because there's a fine line between what we morally view wrong and what we legally view wrong. So perhaps morally there should be reasonable steps that you should take. Perhaps you shouldn't call you shouldn't call the police, or you shouldn't fight against the husband that's beating up the wife, but you should call the police. That's perhaps your obligation from a legal point of view, because of the line being so thin.
I like that you said that, because it brings us to what the discussion on this whole moral or legal obligation is about. Even if we were to say you should just stay in your house and call the police, the question is, why do you have a duty to call the police? Why do you have a duty to your neighbor to do anything to help them? Why do you have a duty to a stranger to do anything to help them? Why do your legal duties within society go beyond duties you have to yourself? Other than the fact that, and you see, it's a really difficult argument because we all know that you're supposed to, we all know it's a good thing to do, but why is it a good thing to do? If I asked you, why don't you hold your responsibility? If I said it's absolutely okay for us to all be individualistic and live our own lives, because if you're unable to take care of yourself or leave your husband, that's your fault. You made that decision, you suffer the consequences. What's the response?
You can't help yourself.
You
can't help yourself. But that person can't help himself. I don't know, maybe from a standpoint of a wife is being beaten repeatedly, or a person is drowning, they don't have the capability to help themselves. I don't know if that's getting to the physical point of view in that line. That's what governments do, or courts do. They look after people who have been wrong but could not help themselves.
Perfect. But then the government or the court should jump in and say it's much better.
Can't you use the reasonable man test and see what the reasonable man would do if there was no harm or something like that, and some person drowned and could just jump in?
Actually, I love reasonable man because in second year, I think it was, I wrote a semi-dissertation on why the reasonable man is a terrible test to use at law, right? And basically, a gist of the argumentation was, you're going to tell society to aspire to act based on what the lowest common denominator in that society would do. So generally, if you live in Nazi Germany, the reasonable man is a person who hates Jews, may not shoot them, but will drive them to a place where they're going to be shot. So the reasonable man changes with regards to where you are in society. It isn't as uniform as it should be, so maybe, I don't know, I'm just saying, it's not a bad idea.
Maybe it's something because we as human beings are so interdependent on each other. Like when you are born from the beginning, you are breastfed by a mother, you are raised by a mother. So we have almost this moral obligation towards other people because we know we are, our survival, this almost instinct is we are for our species to survive, we have to save each other. It's almost like a subconscious drive there.
Right. I like that, and you're going in the right direction, right?
So what happens if we argue that each of these individuals are going to act because individually they want to not feel the guilt of having not acted? That they have this desire within them to not have to deal with their conscience of should I or should I not have acted, and that desire to not have to deal with the terrible feelings of I could potentially prevented this, means that they should act in order for themselves to feel good about what they themselves.
And that's an absolutely legitimate stance to take. But however, it doesn't cover the individual who doesn't want to act and won't feel guilty. So like a psychotic murderer who has no conscience or whatever whatsoever won't be offended by what you're arguing, right? So you're looking for something
right? All the 4 or 5 people will just pass.
Exactly. So people, it's all about a duty that can apply to everyone. And if, to give a little hint here, right, is contrasted with why do you think there's more of a moral obligation to help a little girl than there is to help a big buff Potchefstroom boy? Or why is there more of a legal obligation to help the big buff Potchefstroom boy than there is a legal obligation to help a dog? Why is there more of a legal obligation to help a puppy than there is to help a bobo? Like, why do those, not legal, sorry, moral obligations differ with regards to who you're helping?
Who's more vulnerable?
Yeah,
Think about it. Is that what you're going to say?
more or less.
Right? Because the idea is that you're more vulnerable. So why is it that we need to protect people who are more vulnerable? It's just wrong not to help them. Why is it just wrong?
Guilt.
What does it mean about the kind of person you are?
I would say that aren't we always trying to strive for a society? I'd like to say that we're all trying to strive for a conducive society. So that burden for that conducive society can't be placed purely on the state. It needs to be placed on you as well. So it's not just a psychological thing, but it's an overall thing that you're trying to achieve for society. Not to say individually you feel bad, but society as a whole will feel bad.
I like that. Anyone else?
Because it's what makes us human.
Right. So why is it important to you?
Because otherwise then we are lower than the lowest common denominator.
Okay, why is that?
Because else we're just animals, we're trying to prove that we're sentient beings that happen to be above the average amoeba.
Animals thrive perfectly. What's wrong with being animals?
They don't have brains.
So generally, and I want you guys to go look into this a bit more, so I'm not going to try to give you everything. There are two ideas. There's the debate-to-base idea, which basically is that by virtue of you being a part of society, you have a duty to ensure the development of that society. And the reason you have that duty is because whether you're a criminal, whether you're like a housemaid, whether you're a CEO, in one way or another, you are always going to benefit from society. You may not directly benefit from like the person you're helping, you may not directly benefit even from like, your boss or whatever, but one way or another, you're always going to benefit from society. And the reason you're always going to benefit from society is because resources are spread like amongst everyone within society. What that means is if you want resources, you need to engage to some kind of relationship or interaction with someone who has those resources in order for you to benefit from them. So it's basically that I benefit from something, therefore I have a fundamental duty to ensure that that thing can continue. Because otherwise, it's then that you don't deserve to benefit from that thing. So maybe you shouldn't be a part of that community. So then the debate is, if you don't want to help people who are more vulnerable, then maybe just leave the community and go to a community where you don't have to help people who are more vulnerable. That's the more like easier one to explain. The one debate is not. I'll be with you in a sec, right? There's one more, and it's very ethereal, right? The idea that the way you treat everyone in society is a direct reflection of the kind of people we are on a personal level, right? The next level then is, what kind of people does society thrive to create? And this will link beautifully with why it needs to be a legal obligation, right? So if society as a whole is trying to create people who have a conscience, people who can collectively grow together, because like we generally believe that collectivism is a good thing, then we have a duty to encourage people to act in that way so that society can grow. The people we entrust to ensure that society grows are the government. Therefore, the government have a right to place a legal duty on you to ensure that over and above what you want as an individual, you actively contribute to society so that society can grow. So, if we don't place that legal duty on you, it means that you as an individual are just like, a psychotic person with no emotions or whatever. But the way that affects us is, and this is how you're always able to link it to general behavior traits. People who are generally just like unemotional like that, who don't have a conscience and don't feel the need to help, are people who will be that way in other scenarios within society. So if you look at, for example, the psychology of people who walk into schools and shoot the whole school down, those are the kind of people who don't have a conscience. So the idea is that if you don't weed those people out before they actually do something wrong, then you allow the likelihood of something wrong happening in society. I don't know if it's like cohesive enough for like you guys to understand. Right? You wanted to ask?
Yes. Your first argument was that we all benefit from society in some way. Wouldn't the counter argument to that be that, let's say there's a burning building and there's a little girl stuck up on the 5th floor. People running into the building in fear of facing legal repercussions afterwards by not doing anything. And then the building burns down, everyone dies. Wouldn't that be counter to everybody's profiting from that by losing members of society?
There are two responses to that, right? You could always either argue an absolute, which is not advisable, but it's a lot more difficult for people to rebut. Or my response could be more model heavy, right? So starting with the latter one, which is the easier one. If the question is like a burning building, then I probably would have an debate like that, that as long as people aren't putting themselves in the way of danger, they have a duty to act. So where no harm will come to you, then you have a duty to act. What that means is then your response principally agrees with me if the circumstances are okay. So on a philosophical basis, we're on the same book. But if I want to argue it in absolute, and this is the question I was asking about, why self-preservation is more important than like the preservation of another person. It's the question of how do you weigh rights, and how do you decide which right is more important, right? So a person who doesn't value their life, let's say a suicide bomber, for example, or someone who's suicidal and just wants to die, still has a right to life. A person who's like doing their 3rd year law degree and has a bright future ahead of them and wants to live like the next 30 years so that they can have like all these pro bono cases and help the poor people in society also has a right to life, right? We, in the status quo, believe that those rights to life are equal. I don't think that they are. I think the way we can objectively judge what weight a right has is what value it has to that individual. So to the extent that you can prove that my right to life means less to me than your right to life, then we can prove that I have a duty to protect your right to life, because generally your right to life is more important. So classic case of, like if a criminal is running into the building to help a little girl, because they've committed crimes against society, we generally believe those people not to value social rights and to an extent their own rights as much as the rest of society values those rights. Therefore, their rights are just generally less important than everyone else's. It's an argument to be made. I don't know if you understand.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, Donnie, I just want to say, like, now that you ask some questions, the people have to leave. So what we're going to do is we're just going to let this man speak, and then those of you that want to stay and ask some questions, you can stay and do that. Okay. Awesome.
So let's do the boring man quickly, right? Courts, we're going to look at 4 things. Mandate, independence and objectivity, uniformity of like how they apply the law, and the role in enacting social change. I like the last one. It was actually a very interesting one I had to debate about. But like, what's the mandate of any court? What's the duty of a court, right? What's a court supposed to do? Serve justice, right? Is that all a court's supposed to do?
Decide what's right and wrong.
Settle disputes.
Settle disputes, right? Serve justice and settle disputes. So if you have a terrible constitution that allows, for example, active discrimination against women and children, like our constitution does, should the courts be allowed to enforce that constitution? Is it out of the duty of the court to move away from what the constitution or the fiber of the nation says and do something other than that? So does the court have a right to act extra legally?
I'm not a those things, but isn't the constitutional court here anyways test the constitution, like, or test, for example, Freedom of Information Act?
Yeah, but go on.
Yeah. Well, in South Africa, like, I'm not a law student, but if in South Africa, like, the constitutional
Court has the right to do that.
then test, like, how constitutional something is, or you, and again, it doesn't test the existing constitution, I suppose, so.
There's things against the existing constitution.
Right, so what I'm saying is if a constitution like ours says explicitly something about, and still in the process of changing this though, there was like a brilliant woman who stood up against it and she won a court case. If the constitution says that, if a child is born out of wedlock, then, and that child's father is a foreigner, so for example, if he comes from Norway and the mother's from Botswana, if that child is born out of wedlock, the mother has sovereignty, but that child has the nationality of the father, right? So if a constitution explicitly says something like that, can the court act out of it? And this is just like, it's let's not get too technical, just to try and decide what the duty of a court is and how far that duty extends. So is the court's duty just to interpret what the law is and then met out justice, or is it also to, in certain instances, change what the law is?
Once you're giving
Okay, there's nothing to do with the constitution, but it will depend if your law system is codified or not. Like in South Africa, not all the laws are codified, so that gives the court the discretion to like change law or something if it's not codified.
So it depends on your government functions, right? Whether they are split, like, but the court's only there to enforce the law if you have something like parliamentary or actually make the laws.
Right, that's true. That's basically what happens in the majority of states. You have a separation of powers. So you have your executive, your judiciary, and your legislature, right? So legislature will, like all these parliament idiots, and will make all these laws. The executive will endorse those laws and make those laws into real laws, and then the courts basically just have to carry out the laws. So you have a case, it says rape 15 years, we'll listen to extenuating circumstances, maybe we'll give you 10. But we do have to give you something for raping someone. So the court doesn't have the right to, for example, say, you've raped someone, we're not going to give you 15 years, in fact, we're going to give you $10,000. So it can't act outside of what is codified law. I like that you said that. So that limits really what the court can do. And this links into the last one, right? But let's quickly look at independence and objectivity, right? Like he just said, you will have three arms of government: legislature, executive, and the judiciary. Now, most states try to make the judiciary a separate entity, but there's still things like, the government still pays the judiciary. Things like the government, like in our country, actively chooses who the judges that sit on the bench are. Things like that. So there's a lot of biasness that can seep into a system of justice that when you allow people to have a monopoly of deciding who the people who decide who the judges are, right? So that's another thing we look at. So basically, and I'm going to talk about this just now with the ICC. You look at what a court is meant to do, and what the constitution of the court itself sets it up to do. You can look at whether it's independent and objective. If you can prove that it isn't independent and objective, then you prove that it's an illegitimate body in order to met out the law. If you prove that it is independent and objective, then you prove that it's legitimate. In terms of mandate, if you can prove that the court is achieving what it's set out to achieve, then you prove that the court is legitimate, even though there may be other things that people are accusing it of doing. If you, for example, prove that the court isn't achieving what it's set out to achieve, then basically you prove that the court is illegitimate. So it's basically, if I say I am going to walk to Michelle's house or whatever, right? You can't judge me for not walking to Friendly. You have to judge me by what I said I was going to do, or what the statutes that establish me say they're going to do. Right? In terms of uniformity, and this is where maybe I want to spend 5 minutes, right? We all are in a system of common law to some extent, and there's what's called stare decisis, right? This is basically binding precedents. This means that if one of the highest courts in the land or whatever decide that A is B, no lower court can change that. You guys have the Supreme Court of highest level, right? Constitutional law, right? So if that court decides that gay marriages should be illegal, no court under that can legitimately decide that gay marriage is illegal. So every court after that, whenever it's dealing with a gay marriage case, has to say that gay marriages are illegal. What that means is the monopoly of deciding the really big decisions within society lies basically in one court. Now, quickly, show of hands, who thinks that's a good system because it allows for uniformity of law, and we all know what the law is, we all know what to expect? Who thinks it's a terrible system because it doesn't allow for the law to be adequately critiqued? Who thinks it's a good system? 1, 2. Who thinks it's a terrible system? The rest of you. All right, let's start with the guys who think it's a good system, because they just fewer. Right?
Why is that a good system? In fact, the lower courts can still question all of those decisions. They can still prefer them and then decide again.
All right, yeah, and that's probably something I just need to clarify for the rest of you. A lower court can ask for a decision to go to review. So if it's dealing with like a gay marriages case, it can't decide that you guys can go and get married, but it can apply to the highest court, the one which decided that gay marriage was illegal, to have that reviewed. So although